As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
I think ACT is contextual, and I think burnout is a contextual problem. I think the other thing, though, is that with burnout, you do see that detachment. You see people just feeling this fundamental sense of like, I don't care about this anymore. I don't want to keep doing it. I'm tired. I'm just not feeling it anymore. And ACT is fundamentally about helping people have meaningful engagement in their values and in a meaningful life. And so to me, there's a really clear philosophical fit there.
That was our very own Dr. Debbie Sorensen on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are four experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of ACT for Burnout, ACT Daily Journal, and the ACT Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey, everybody. We have a super special episode because today we are talking about and celebrating Debbie's brand new book, ACT for Burnout, which is such a tremendous resource. I think we're going to learn so much today about what burnout is and isn't, and how to effectively manage it. Or as we were talking about even before we hit record, how this book could actually really be an important resource for preventing getting to that point of burnout in the first place. But I always love to know, usually they say research is me search, and why you were interested in writing this book in the first place, Debbie.
Well, I got interested in burnout a long time ago when I tell the story in the book, and I've actually told it on the podcast before once or twice, that I hit a burnout patch when I was working in a hospital setting as a psychologist, and I had 2 young kids, and I was very stressed out all the time. And it took me a while to recognize that I was burned out, which really surprised me in hindsight, because I know about burnout and I talk to people about burnout, but when I personally experienced it, it took a while for me to realize that. And once I did, I was able to make some changes, and even just realizing it transformed some things for me. And because of that experience, I got really more interested in learning more about it, delving into it, ultimately ended up specializing in burnout in my clinical work, as now I'm in private practice, and burnout is a major area I work with. Anyway, that's all a very long story, but I started to feel like I had a point of view about burnout that I wasn't really seeing anywhere else. I think having experienced it personally and worked with clients who had burnout, but whose burnout experience was so different person to person. And I think that it seems kind of simple, burnout. It just seems, we all know what that is. It seems simple. But I was finding that it was really complicated. And I was reading everything I could about burnout, and I was sort of connecting some dots about things. And I just felt like I had a point of view that I wanted to get out there. And I thought a lot about, why am I doing this? Why burnout? And why am I writing this book? At the point of writing the book, when it felt like very stressful and so much work to me. And that was still the thing that was driving me, was I want this point of view out there. I think I had like synthesized information in a way that I wanted to tell this story.
I love it. It's like the irony of, I'm feeling burnt out, but I'm going to do more, but the role of values in making that choice, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later in the interview.
Yeah. I mean, we had this running joke in my house for a year when I was writing it about how the Burnout book was burning us all out. Trust me, my dear husband made this comment about 1,000 times about how this was the thing taking us all over the edge of burnout.
Well, the other phrase I heard recently, and it might have been Emily's friend Danielle that said it to me, I'm not 100% sure, but it was not just research is me search, but your mess is your message. And I loved that even more. I thought that was so cute. Right?
Got to learn the hard way sometimes, right?
So something that I learned in this book, also going into the book, thinking that, of course, I know what burnout is. And then here comes Dr. Debbie Sorensen and like takes the entire thing apart and lays down the pieces. And like, wow, like this really clicks. So maybe in order for us to set up for us and for our listeners what burnout is, could you maybe give us a high-level overview over the 3 dimensions of burnout that you write about in the book?
Sure. Yeah. And this is sort of the classic definition of burnout, and that's been around a while, and the World Health Organization adopted it. But of course, it's complicated because, there's controversy around all these kinds of terms and definitions. But the official definition has those 3 criteria. The first one is feeling exhausted and depleted. And I really do like to point out, it's not just your run-of-the-mill tiredness, where if you get a couple nights of sleep and you're sleep deprived, but you feel better. It's different than that. It's more of this, just you're tired to the bone. It's more, to me, it's almost like an emotional exhaustion. I've got nothing left to give kind of feeling. The second criteria has more to do with being a bit cynical or kind of negative about things, or detached, where you're just kind of less engaged even. And burnout often happens in roles that people really care about when they're not burned out. So I care a lot about my role as a psychologist, but when I'm burnt out, it's just like, why am I doing this? You're just not as emotionally engaged, and you have that kind of cynical point of view.
Is being engaged and in air quotes, in love with one's job, is that something that makes us more prone to being burnout than being in a job that we just do to pay the rent?
So that is such a great question, because I think that being very emotionally engaged in a job or another role can be a risk factor, because if you put so much into your work, you're going to be chronically stressed, which is what drives burnout, right? It's chronic stress over the course of time. And sometimes it's almost that over-engagement that tends to make it so that people burn out. But I don't think it's actually a requirement of it, because I think sometimes people have jobs that they don't feel super passionate about and they still get burnt out. Okay. People have maybe tedious jobs or jobs they're just doing for a paycheck, but it does seem to be a risk factor. Yeah, that's a great question.
So we had exhaustion to the bone. We had cynicism and
detachment. Yep. The third criteria is feeling less effective at your work. That one's a little bit controversial because not everyone seems to have that. And some people say it's not really necessary to be burned out. But I think often what you find is that people might feel less effective, even if they are still effective. They're just kind of not feeling good about their work. But also sometimes because people are burned out, they're actually doing less, or they're putting less effort into it. And sometimes one of the things you see with burnout for some people can be that they're just not doing the same level of work that they used to be, understandably, right? Yeah. And to say, I will say that it is specific to a stressful role. So these criteria happen, but it's always within the context of a stressful role like a job. And chronic stress is part of it. And that's very clear in the definition of burnout. It's caused by chronic stress over the course of time.
Well, and I think something else that you do at the beginning of the book that's really helpful is distinguishing between all these terms that we just sort of casually throw out in our culture. I'm so stressed, I'm so anxious, I'm so burned out, but there really are differences, like qualitative differences, right, that you kind of talk about. So could you help us all like separate those out and understand how they're different, how they overlap?
Absolutely. And yes, of course, this is very complicated because there's a lot of overlap. So I think it's in some ways similar to depression. And some people have suggested that it might be just a very specific form of depression where you just feel low energy, just blah about things. But I think the difference between burnout and depression is that it is in that context of chronic stress. And it's usually just in that specific role, right? So if I'm burnt out at work, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to feel like I'm having fun on the weekends with my friends, whereas depression tends to be a bit more global. And there's certain other differences too in terms of this, how the quote symptoms present themselves.
Well,
I think it's also
actually going to go with that, Debbie, in terms of the comparison to depression is lots of people say, oh, I'm so depressed. And really they just mean I'm having a low mood today. But that's not depression. Depression is a constellation of at least between 5 and 9 symptoms for a certain period of time. And in some ways I think of like, oh, I'm so stressed this is a thing I'm feeling right now about a situation that's happening right now. And when that situation is resolved, I'm going to go back to feeling better. Whereas burnout is more of this like constellation of symptoms that's more chronic.
Yes, a bit more chronic. And that's exactly right. The difference between stress and burnout is that stress is like situation. It's like you don't have enough resources to meet the demands of a situation. So it could be time, it could be support, etc. Stress will resolve itself when that goes away, right? It's like I'm stressed about this deadline and then it kind of, gets better versus burnout's a little bit more ongoing because it's chronic stress. And burnout, it doesn't resolve itself when like one stressful thing lightens up. And then anxiety. And I think it's interesting because both anxiety and burnout, they, often they go together because when you're in chronic stress, you worry and you're just feeling anxious often as you're going through things. But anxiety to me has a little bit more of an up feel to it. It's like your mind is racing and you're feeling kind of charged up versus burnout feels a little bit more just down and tired and depleted. So to me, they're both can happen even at the same time in the face of chronic stress, but they have a slightly different quality to them.
Maybe they lead to burnout. Like if you're in a job that's sort of triggering chronic anxiety, stress, et cetera, maybe those are risk factors for
absolutely.
burnout.
Yeah.
Right. Because that anxiety puts you in this constant state of activation and arousal, which is exhausting in itself. So if that's enduring over a long period of time, I can see how that then dips, right? Because the energy stores just are gone. And I mean, I've seen that working in my practice as well.
Yeah. I say in my book, and I like to say this in general, that, to some degree, it doesn't really matter that much what label you put on your experience. I think I'm more interested in, okay, what's going on in your life? What's the situation? What's the context? What's happening? How are you feeling? What's working? What's not working? And sometimes it's such a complicated mix. I'm less concerned about specifically which category, are you depressed or anxious or burned out? It's like, well, what's going on? And how can we get you to a better place? And so I like to not get too concerned about the semantics of that because they are complicated and they do have overlap. And often you'll experience more than one at the same time. But it is, I think, important to think about, what's the impact of this on me and how am I feeling?
So I thought we could talk a little bit about different contexts too. So, we've mostly so far been talking about the context of feeling burnt out at work, but people can also experience burnout in caregiving roles or parenting or even social justice or activist roles. And I'm curious, can you talk about some of the risk factors for burnout, across these different categories, and then also some of the impacts of burnout?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what all of those arenas have in common, caregiving, athletes can get burned out. So people who are doing social justice or nonprofit activism type work can get burnt out. Parents, I think, and then of course, traditional job roles of various types. I think what drives all of these is that they're usually roles that are important, that are a big part of people's lives, where they put a lot of time and effort, and where is that chronic stress. And I absolutely think it's contextual. And that's part of why I like ACT as an approach, because ACT is a contextual behavioral therapy. I think that often people are at risk if they're in a situation where they're feeling, again, overworked, of course, right? They just feel like they don't have enough resources to meet the demands, and that's chronic over time. Often there will be something about the environment. Maybe it's a complicated team dynamic, or they're working in a system where, there's just problems. There's day-to-day stressors. Some people call them micro stressors, where just one thing after the next is driving a high degree of stress, not feeling supported enough, not feeling appreciated, like with compensation, or not feeling like you have enough autonomy to make your own decisions. Those types of things, I think, are the contextual factors. And then we also know that there are some personal factors that may contribute as well. So people who are highly perfectionistic tend to be at risk for burnout. People who are high achieving and ambitious, and who tend to invest a lot in whatever role it is, whether it's parenting or a job. If you put a lot of pressure on yourself to do it really well, that adds to the stress. And also, I think that people who are doing meaning-driven work, or work that involves people often. And so caregiving and parenting obviously do too. And I think people who are in jobs where they're working with clients or with people who need help or support, or even in customer service roles or something like that. Now, that's not always the case. I think you can get burnt out in a huge range of different industries, but I think that often there is that working with people component that can contribute as well. And so there's other risk factors, but those are some of the main ones.
I found myself in this place of really realizing that I was, if not completely burned out, like really on the road, on the edge. And of course, it was during COVID. And I think a big part of that, it was a lot of the factors that you just described, but it was also this unique time period as a therapist where it was like the first time you're in a position to have to be helping people through this really insanely difficult thing while you're struggling with it at the same time. Yep. And it felt really hard to care for other people at a time where I was so depleted in a way that I had never been before, right? As we're educating our kids at home, all the things. We don't need to go over it, but.
Well, and I remember in that time period, I would have like 6 to 8 sessions a day, and everyone was talking about it.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was all day responding to each person's experience and struggle and suffering while I'm managing my own experience. And that was very overwhelming. So, and it was a unique situation for sure that we hadn't been through yet to know how to manage it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think COVID was the perfect storm for burnout in so many ways. And unfortunately, a lot of the stressors that were there have shifted for the better in the last couple of years. That was just such an acute period of time. But I also think some of the stressors in the world continue. And I think in the backdrop, we're all trying to do the best to manage our lives and manage whatever type of work we happen to be doing. And then we also live in a world where there's a number of stressors in the background all the time.
Yep. Well, and what the pandemic did is really revealed a lot of the weaknesses in our infrastructures, right? And social safety nets and just supportive systems, and how many like cracks in the foundations there were. And there are. I mean, they still haven't been fixed. And you actually spent time in the book talking about the macro level, right? And how capitalism has an influence on individual burnout. And I thought that was really interesting how you wove that in, and how it's a really important consideration.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you can't really talk or write about burnout without acknowledging the systems in which we live that got us into this mess. And I think that the good news is that we're seeing more people speak up about that, how some of the culture level systems in which we work are really driving this problem. And that's why we're seeing such levels of burnout, is because we've gotten to this point where it's not really humane anymore. we're not working the way we were kind of meant to work as humans in these small groups and sharing the load and that kind of thing. And I think that we're in the book I write about, and I'm not the first one to come up with this idea, but that kind of culture of how we're supposed to be working all the time and grinding away, and we're working within these systems that the idea is to squeeze every ounce of labor out of people that can possibly be squeezed. And then you have all kinds of other impacts for disproportionately affecting certain groups of people. And it just leaves us in this place where it's really not sustainable. And we see the impact of that on our lives.
Right. It's profit over people, but it's very short-sighted, because when you don't prioritize your people, it ultimately impacts your profit.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's not good for anyone in the long run.
Right.
And I think a lot of people have probably been in job settings where they feel disposable.
Mhm.
So if you get so burned out you can't do the job anymore, that's okay. They can replace you.
Find someone else.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and one part of my personal burnout experience that I think a lot of people will relate to is that I really blamed myself for a long time. When I was burnt out, I felt like, oh, if I could just get caught up, if I could just get more efficient and get my act together, then I'll get on top of this stress and then I'll be okay. And I really wasn't looking at the fact that I was in kind of an unsustainable situation at the time. And I really had to set some limits and some boundaries. But I see that all the time in my work, where it kind of feels like, what's wrong with me? I'm so stressed out. If I could do this better or that better, if I didn't spend so much time doing this or that, then I'd be okay. And it's like, no, you're working within a system where you're never going to be caught up. Right. And it's not you that's the problem here. And I think even just having that shift, and actually it's interesting because I think sometimes when people leave a really stressful role, they can look back at it and see, oh, no wonder I was so exhausted. That was so stressful. But I think when you're in it, it's really strangely hard to see that. And so it actually fosters a little bit of self-compassion, I think, to look at these big cultural and systemic contributors, because you can be like, oh, it's not my fault. It makes so much sense that I'm feeling this way. Of course, I have to figure out what I'm going to do about it, but it's not me. That's the problem.
Right.
Here.
Well, I was just going to say, and I think sometimes you get, because the same thing happens for me with the imposter syndrome stuff, is you have critics who come and say, well, this isn't an individual problem. This is an organizational and systemic problem. So stop saying you have imposter syndrome. But yes, even though the causes of burnout may be predominantly organizational and systemic, those things are not going to change quickly, if at all, living in a super capitalistic society. And so we still need strategies to be able to figure out how to navigate these really challenging environments that we find ourselves in that aren't necessarily going to change overnight. And that it's like this both and problem, right?
Exactly.
Yes, it's being triggered by the systems, the organizations, and as individuals, we need to have helpful ways of being able to manage the pieces we can't control.
I completely agree, because I agree that it is systemic and cultural, really, at the core. That's really what's the issue here. And so you shouldn't blame yourself. But at the same time, I want to help people who are experiencing it. I don't want to say, well, I'm sorry, I can't help you because we really need to change the culture first, because that is a very hard problem. And I try to write about that. What can we do about these problems? But at the same time, it's like, I don't want to leave people high and dry until then.
Right.
Yeah. And I have to talk about parenting real quick.
because you write about burnout.
No, you cannot talk about parenting.
The bingo card. Drink coffee every time Emily talks about parenting. But there's really been this predominant cultural message, I feel like, in parenting guidance over the last decade or so, maybe even a little longer, of that larger cultural stay calm and carry on idea. But it's really promoted everywhere I look to stay calm with your children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unrealistic and leads to so much guilt. And I would say also risk of burnout, because if as a parent, especially if your main role is caregiving at home all day with your children, and you feel like you are not allowed to express yourself emotionally or react to your child in an authentic way, that is so much emotional repression. And that is really damaging, psychologically and emotionally. So anyways, I had to insert that. And you talk about in the book the myths about emotions and stress and how our culture tends to villainize stress, like there should be no stress, which is just not true. And at the same time, promote toxic positivity. Just think positive and it's all on you to make your situation better. So I think there's a lot, in addition to the capitalism and the structures, there's also these cultural messages that we're all absorbing.
Absolutely. I'm glad you raised parenting for that example, because I think that is really true. And I think it's really true in traditional workplaces too, right? Where it's almost like, well, you should come in and do your work and you should never feel much of anything about that. You certainly should never cry at work or let people see how stressed out you are or show it in any way. Maybe that's changing a little bit and maybe certain industries are better than others. But I mean, oftentimes I think people feel like they have to hide it and they should just be calm and composed all the time. And that's not really possible when you're spending all these hours and putting all this time and effort into your work. You're going to feel things. And I think we've actually done ourselves a disservice by taking on that stance, because instead of allowing ourselves to feel all the emotions we feel in this more open and real and genuine way, it's like we're adding to the stress by feeling like, well, I'm stressed, but I shouldn't be stressed, and stress is bad and I have to hide it. And you know what I mean?
And now you're stressed about stress, so you're stressed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which leads to this interesting concept of the burnout cycle that you write about, where people might be in the situation where they realize, oh, okay, there seems to be something burnout related happening in my life. Let me go in and fix it or work on it. And it actually might be pouring gasoline on the fire instead of actually putting it out.
Yeah. For the ACT nerds out there who know about this, I kind of mapped on the idea of creative hopelessness or experiential avoidance onto burnout, because I think what we often do is that we're feeling stressed, we're having some of these symptoms of burnout. We try to do things that make sense on the surface to try to make it better, but that actually often dig us in deeper in the long run. And so I think that really can happen very easily with chronic stress, which is through no fault of our own. I mean, we're doing things that make perfect sense, but we end up just keeping the cycle going and digging ourselves in deeper into it. And then it gets even harder, I think, to get out of it. Because naturally, I feel like what happens for me when I'm not burned out is that I go through periods, kind of peaks and valleys with stress and even with exhaustion, where it's like, okay, this is hard, I'm feeling tired, but it will sort of come and go. But I think the difference between that and the phase in my own life when I was so burnt out was that I was really clamped down on it in a way that it was just causing it to get worse and worse and worse. And again, it's not really my fault. I was doing all the reasonable things that a person would do when they're under stress, but it was just not helping the situation. And so I wasn't seeing that just kind of come and go effect, which even during COVID, for me, that's what was happening. I'd have my days or even longer where I was just really stressed and tired, but it would naturally resolve itself. And I think the difference with burnout is that you just get really, really stuck in that cycle. And it's very hard to see a way out of it.
The realization that I had when I was reading about that burnout cycle was that when I do realize I'm overworked and I need a rest, I put yet another thing on my to-do list, namely go to bed early, watch a movie, eat a healthy meal really slowly. And then I'm freaking out because I'm lying in bed at 10 p.m. and I know that I should be sleeping now, or I should be enjoying this movie, or I should be enjoying this meal. And it just, it's a cycle. Now it's even more that needs to be done in order to prevent something that I've just been reinforcing by adding yet another item to it.
And I'm glad you raised that particular example, because I think often the quick fix method for burnout is something like that. Well, go to bed earlier, which I'm not saying you shouldn't. You probably should go to bed earlier.
I should. You're absolutely right.
You should do self-care. You should do yoga. You should do mindfulness. You should go on a vacation, take a day off. Those are all great things to do. I'm not at all trying to say that you shouldn't. Those might help you. But I think that often the problem with that is that that's not enough. And also it gives you this one more thing to do. Oh yeah, well, you're burned out because you're not doing enough self-care. So you should spend 2 hours a day on self-care on top of everything else you're doing. And can you see how that's not really going to eliminate the stress in the long run? So it is something that might be helpful. I'm not saying that it's not, but I think when you look at that as a solution, like, well, that's going to fix it, then you're layering on one more thing to do. And so it's actually making you sometimes more stressed. Now I have to fit in 90 minutes of yoga a day on top of everything else without dropping anything, right?
But the good thing is if you forget about it, your yoga app, your meditation app, your language learning app is going to remind you.
Yes.
With a really like guilt invoking little message that says, hey, Michael, you haven't learned Spanish today. Why don't you get started before you go to bed? But before I rant.
The little guilt, the little guilt cue.
Little is good. Yeah, this is like solidly crafted guilt-infusing messages.
Uh-huh.
And you're talking about 10 burnout cycle subtypes in the book, and you probably won't have time to go through all of them, but I thought it might be a fun little quiz if we try to sort of like guess each other's burnout type. And then maybe you, Debbie, you can, as the burnout expert here in the room, you can say a few words about that particular type. And in that way, maybe we get like 30 seconds of free psychotherapy out of this interview as well. So
sounds good.
Where should we start? Emily, do you want to guess what Jill's subtype is?
Sure. I will guess Jill's, although I got a little peek, but so I think Jill can get into busy bee.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I would self-identify as. Yes, the busy bee.
My
husband used to literally buzz at me from the sofa. Well, literally, like would buzz bzzz, as I was like flitting around doing all of the things, even when there was like nothing that really needed to be done.
Well, and I think this one is similar, but I wonder if you also get into marching soldier.
Which one is that? Okay, Debbie, do you want to define busy bee and marching soldier so listeners know what we're talking about?
And let me just say high level that these aren't like super scientific or completely distinct categories, but these are patterns I've seen with people getting into the burnout cycle. And so, you can probably relate to more than one of these. Maybe we all do most of them from time to time, but the busy bee, the way I like to think about it is, and by the way, kudos to Jill Stoddard, who read some early drafts of my work and helped me come up with these categories. So thank you, Jill. I think you actually named a couple of them.
I might have, yeah. This might have been one because I was remembering Billy buzzing at me from the sofa. Yeah.
So I think the idea behind the busy bee is that you try to outrun stress by working hard and being busy. And it does two things. One is that it helps you avoid the deeper level of pain and suffering that's going on because you're too busy to pay attention to it. But also it really does have this feeling of like, oh, if I just get all this stuff done, I'll be okay. And then I won't be so stressed anymore. But what ends up happening is that you're just busy all the time. You have trouble taking a break. You have trouble turning off that get stuff done mode. So that's the busy bee. And then the marching soldier is one, to me, it's more like stoic, For me, it's a day-to-day thing where I'll be like, okay, I can't sit down and rest until I've finished my work and the kids are in bed and the dishes are done. And no matter how tired I am, I just keep going until I just kind of crash and burn at some point. But it can have that feeling in your whole life, like, okay, I'm just going to keep in a medical setting, like I'm going to keep seeing the next patient and the next patient and the next patient. I'm not going to slow down and I'm not going to take any time for myself to feel anything about that. I just keep going. Soldier on.
Like head down and soldier on.
That's right.
You know what's interesting? I think when I'm anxious, I tend to busy bee. But when I'm feeling a little more of the like lower energy pain is more of a marching soldier.
Yeah, I could see that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was right.
Yeah.
All right.
I think.
Nice.
Okay, Jill, what am I? What subtype am I?
I read through all of these and I think I don't really know, because I feel like you're someone who's like very well adjusted and healthy, and I'm like, I don't think he's does any of these things. But the one that I'm going to
awesome
guess,
isn't a subtype. I was looking
right,
for
exactly.
it, but there's
That's
no
what
awesome
I was looking
subtype.
for. I was like, where's the subtype for someone who's perfect? And then I was like, oh wait, maybe he's the perfectionist.
That's absolutely correct.
Is it? Oh, nice.
Absolutely.
I love it. Yay. I mean, not yay for you being a perfectionist, but yay for getting it right.
Do you have a little bit of comfort seeker too, though, Michael, where you like to kind of maybe watch a show or like do something that's kind of immediate gratification? That's another one that I wondered about with you.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Okay, so I'll walk you
Let me
through
have
those
it.
both really quickly. The perfectionist, I think, is pretty obvious because it's like people get this sense of control out of trying to do everything just right. And so the idea is like, well, I won't be stressed if I have everything totally under control and perfect and all tied up in a neat little bow. And of course, you can see where that one goes haywire. And then the comfort seeker, I call it, is maybe someone who goes toward either alcohol or scrolling on their phone or a TV show or something like that. It's that I think of it as kind of like the immediate gratification type. And it often is fine and great unless it becomes like you're doing that maybe too much. Alcohol is a great example of that. Like, oh, I de-stress at the end of the day with a couple of glasses of wine. Okay, that's fine. But often then you feel worse the next day and then you're really relying on those glasses of wine, and they can be, obviously, there could be some downsides to using that as a coping strategy, just as an example. So it's one of those short-term, long-term kind of things.
Gotcha. So a little bit of video games and wine is okay, but I should draw the line at Molly and strippers, basically.
Well, I mean, I'm not here to judge. It's more like, moderation. How's it impacting your life? If you're using those and it's, causing you to be more stressed in the long run or having some other negative impact, you might want to consider cutting back.
All right, Debbie, I am going to guesstimate your subtype. I think you are a marching soldier.
I definitely can be. Yes, I can be.
Is that what you would identify as your top one? What do you think you are?
I think that I do have a lot of that. And then I think I have a healthy dose of the people pleaser in me as well. So I'd say I'm probably a combination of those two. But I'm working on the people pleaser part. And so the people pleaser, I think in the short term tries to manage stress by making everybody happy and avoiding conflict and that kind of thing and saying yes to things. But then in the long run, clearly that just gets to be really a huge contributor to stress when you're constantly trying to make everybody happy and do everything for everyone. And then the marching soldier we already talked about. So good job, Michael.
So Debbie, what subtype does Emily have?
So it's interesting because I was saying earlier, I don't think I've really seen the dark side of Emily yet enough to be able to fully pinpoint this. I'm wondering if you have some perfectionism and some overthinking. That was my hunch. And what do you think, Emily?
I would say yes and yes. And it's interesting because as I was reading about the cycles, I could see like developmentally how I changed too. So I think it was different when I was a teenager versus my 20s versus my 30s, where, in your 30s, often you have more roles. And also, as we were just talking now, I would say I am also a people pleaser in my family role. Like I really want everyone to be okay in my family. And what I can end up doing is just taking on more than I should. That ends up leaving me really resentful and exhausted and but I just did it because it was easy in the moment to say, I'll take care of it. I got it, to spare the other people from taking the load. So that was interesting as we were talking about it, how I could see myself in different stages and in different roles playing out the different dark sides of Emily.
Right. That's true. And I think that's another good point. You're not necessarily going to say this one totally defines me. You know, it's like we have a little grab bag, but also it does shift and it could be different in one role versus another. Absolutely. Yeah.
I call myself a recovering people pleaser because that definitely used to be a huge issue for me. And then I went to therapy specifically to like learn how to have boundaries and be more assertive and stop doing that. And, you know, I definitely still have to fight it sometimes here and there. But yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that, Emily. It does seem to shift over time developmentally.
So had you defined the overanalyzer one?
Oh, the overanalyzer. So that's a person who tries to think their way out of their problems and who tries to fix their problems by, you know, thinking them through. And I think humans in general tend to be really good at this. But I think when it gets over applied, what it looks like and what I see, I think in my clinical practice is someone who's just going around and around in their mind, right? So just spinning their wheels mentally. And I think when you're in that place, we all get there sometimes. You're worried, you're ruminating, you're kind of preoccupied, you're fixated on something. But I think what happens is that we can get really out of the moment when we're just up in our heads all the time and just overthinking and going around and around something. It makes it hard sometimes to be effective or to even just turn that off. You know, it's like, I mean, who can relate to this when you're stressed and then it's Saturday and you're going to take the day off and the whole time you're thinking about all the stressors that are hanging. And it's like, wow, I should be enjoying this beautiful day in the mountains or whatever. And instead I'm just fixated on work. I think that's a sign of the overthinking pattern.
I had an overthinker describe it to me as it's like being on a treadmill where you're working really, really hard and not getting anywhere new.
Yes.
That's perfect.
That's well put.
Isn't that great?
Yeah. That's a fun game. I like it. You can read the book and then play what type am I with your friends.
Yeah. Or you can just walk down the street and point at people and say, you are, and then see how they react. It's a
good idea, Michael. Really seems like a great idea.
I'm not sure. No, this is no medical advice at this podcast. This is for entertainment purposes only, mostly mine.
Mostly mine. Michael's entertainment.
So Debbie, I had a question that this might be like a pretty big question, but I'm guessing that when you work with your clients on burnout, that a big question that people have is, do I leave my job? Like, should I stay and try to figure out how to manage this? Or do I just need to like quit and get out of here? And, you know, obviously you can't tell them what to do as their therapist, but how do you manage that question?
I mean, it's a big one. And I think that probably a lot of people who read the book will be grappling with that. I mean, the first thing I say is let's do a values check-in on how much do you care about this? Is this important to you or not? If it is important to you, what's important to you in the big picture? Because maybe, for instance, you care about your work, but this particular job setting isn't really working for you. So maybe you stay in the field, but you switch to a different job or not. Maybe you're thinking of a bigger change. I really encourage people not to make that decision impulsively when they're at the low moment of burnout. Because I think sometimes, like for me, it would have been a terrible decision if I, at my lowest point of burnout, decided to leave the field of psychology because I love my work. I think I needed to make some minor changes. I also think for some people, it's just not an option. You know, you might have financial reasons or your family relies on you for benefits, or it's just, there's so many reasons sometimes where people just can't make a job change. I mean, it's not always possible, or at least it's not always a good idea. So to me, I like to just help people think through some things like, you know, what is it about this particular situation that's working and not working for me? How does this fit in with my life goals in general? And then I actually wrote about a couple of these things, but I have a lot of thoughts around like, how do you make a decision about quitting or not quitting? Actually, we had Annie Duke on the podcast who talked about her book, Quit. I draw a lot from that. Like sometimes we need to quit some things. Maybe it's a little side project you're doing that you just shouldn't be doing anymore. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's a relationship that's gotten really hard that you need to quit. But there can be a lot that goes into that decision. Maybe you want to try to make the best of it and see if you can change anything. And then if you can't, right? Like I've tried really hard to improve this situation and it's not getting me anywhere.
Right. Sometimes it's like a multi-stepped, multi-layered process. Jenna Lejeune, who is a past guest of ours, she came on to talk about values in therapy, and she shared an exercise with me that it's a values exercise, but it's really getting people in touch with their why for when they first got into the job or the field, like really connecting, because I think sometimes people have lost sight of it if they're currently burned out. You know, that cynical piece, it's probably hard to connect with what's important to you and the why. And this was a perspective taking exercise of revisiting, you know, back in the old days, maybe when you were first going to school for something or first getting your first job, you know, what was your why, your purpose at that time?
Yeah.
And I found that to be really powerful.
That can be really helpful. I think reconnecting, especially if you feel like you shouldn't or can't leave. I would say too, on the other side of the equation, sometimes a situation is really bad. I mean, I was just reading about a really toxic workplace environment recently where people were just being mistreated and it was really terrible. But I think it can be hard to leave those sometimes because it's scary, right? It's like, this is what I know. I've been doing this particular job for a long time, and to leave that and go out on the job market and take my chances that it might be worse, that can be hard too. So I think sometimes there has to be some courage and some willingness. And so, you know, again, sometimes that actually is the better answer. I want to make a career change. I want to go into something totally different or go back to school even or something like that. But I think that that can be hard too. And there can be loss when you leave behind something that you've been doing. And so there's just a lot to process there.
Totally. And I think as psychologists, you know, the other thing we need to look at is, you're talking about the person who's been in the job for a very long time. But if there's the person who's done a lot of job jumping, then the issue may not be that you need to leave yet another job, right? There's clearly something else that's going on there that needs to be talked about. And so maybe this is a good segue. You know, the book is ACT for Burnout. So talk to us about why you think ACT is a particularly good fit for this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I already talked about the contextual piece. I think ACT is contextual, and I think burnout is a contextual problem. I think the other thing, though, is that with burnout, you do see that detachment. You see people just feeling this fundamental sense of like, I don't care about this anymore. I don't want to keep doing it. I'm tired. I'm just not feeling it anymore. And ACT is fundamentally about helping people have meaningful engagement in their values and in a meaningful life. And so to me, there's a really clear philosophical fit there. And when I think about burnout and a client who's sitting with me, my goal isn't to get them unburned out so that they can just go back to being productive again. It's like, I want you to have a fulfilling life. And so that might mean making some changes with your work role. It might mean doing something totally different, or it might mean just continuing to do what you're doing, but to reconnect with that spark of vitality. And so to me, on that level, ACT is a really good fit for burnout. And of course, there are some studies, not a ton, but there's a number of studies supporting the use of ACT as a method for burnout. So that's important too. But I think just that fundamental idea of like, how can we reconnect you with that spark of vitality and that sense of meaning and purpose? It may not be in your role, right? Like you may just go in, do your job, get a paycheck, and then have meaning in other parts of your life, you know, your family life or your hobbies or whatever the case may be. But I still don't want you to be going through your 8 hours of work every day feeling completely devoid of any meaning. And sometimes it might be not through the work itself, but for instance, like, oh, I have some coworkers I really enjoy, or, oh, I use my time at work to do something that's a little bit creative or something that matters in the world. And so I would like for people to at least have a little sense of that, even if their life isn't all about getting meaning from their work.
Well, I imagine one of the other ways that ACT is probably a good fit for this too is, you know, you described at the beginning of the interview the way sometimes depression and burnout can seem sort of similar. And when you're in a bad mood space, it influences the way that you feel about what you're doing and the way you see what you're doing. And so I imagine learning to change your relationship to all the thoughts and feelings that are getting triggered when you're having this experience of burnout is really important too. And, you know, the reason I love ACT is because you get to let go of the struggle of trying to fix all of those things.
Yeah. And I think that internal transformation is really important when it comes to burnout. And so you alluded to a couple of these processes, Jill. And again, people who are familiar with ACT will know what I'm talking about here. I think one of the things that can help with burnout is to open up more to your emotions, right? To feel all the emotions, ups and downs and everything that comes with doing a demanding role, to be more open in your emotional experience, to be more aware of things like your thoughts. So for instance, if you're getting really tripped up in particular narratives and thoughts around your work or about yourself as a worker, like, we kind of internalize some of these cultural messages like, don't be lazy, don't stop working, those kinds of things. So we have to really zoom out and do some perspective taking on some of these things, right? To kind of take a higher point of view and to get less bogged down by those. And sometimes we have to also practice a little bit of self-compassion, just being more present in the moment instead of going off like in our minds on that overthinking thing. And so all of the ACT processes come into play here when you think about, okay, I'm burnt out. How do I re-engage with my work? Or even I want to prevent myself from becoming burned out. And so that's kind of the middle section of the book, is around how do you do this internal shift with yourself when you're burnt out to get out of those burnout cycles? Because again, those cycles will just keep going. But we can do things to kind of shift our point of view and to feel what we feel so that we get out of that cycle of avoidance and control.
Yeah, which feels especially important for people who have decided, at least for right now, they're not going to pivot, leave the job or go do something different. Like, okay, I've made the choice to be here. Now, how can I do this well so that I'm not suffering so much?
That's right.
And I would like to say at this point that I wish we could just go through each and every one of the processes that you explain in your book, because you do it so well. Like, not only is this a AAA graded version of explaining the ACT hexaflex, but it just matches so perfectly with the idea of this is how you use it for burnout. This is how you deal with your unhelpful thoughts that come to you as your, the perfectionist, the people pleaser, the everything. Here's how you deal with them. Here are unhelpful emotions. Here's how you make room for them. Here's how you bring in mindfulness and the entire thing. And you do it so beautifully that I just wanted to say you should write a book, but fortunately you did. So I just have the highest praise for your explanation of bringing acceptance and commitment therapy into the burnout field.
Thank you, Michael.
Yes, and
so
it's
kind.
such an accessible book. It just, you do such a good job of finding that balance of, teaching sophisticated concepts in a way that's interesting and readable and accessible and applicable, like things that we can actually start doing right away, either to address burnout or prevent it. Yeah, it's really, really well done, Debbie.
Thank you.
And I would encourage, actually, as we're talking about all of this, people in all roles and at all stages of potential burnout, actual burnout, risk burnout would benefit from this. And I'm thinking like even managers and leaders, organizational leaders really should read this and understand how the systems and structures affect the individual as well. Because you can meditate and get the free mindfulness app or the pass to the gym because your workplace is supporting health, but that's not really addressing what is actually risking burnout. So I just think your book has benefits for such a wide audience. I'm so excited that it's finally out there.
Thank you. I want to say that piece that you're talking about with, sometimes I think people get criticized for giving employees these burnout prevention things that are short-sighted, right? Oh, here, take this free gym pass, or here's a 5-minute massage you can get at work or something like that, if they don't also address the real systemic problems. And I think we've seen more and more people speaking out about that. And I wish I could have actually written about this more in my book, but the last chapter is about systemic changes and things that leaders can do and executives can do and things that we can all do to try to shift the system a little bit. And I know that's a tall order. I mean, I was a little daunted by trying to write that chapter because I'm like, where do I even begin and what can we do? But I do think that there are things we can do that are deeper than just a free yoga pass.
Well, and 2023 was the year of union organization for labor. I mean, there was a lot of action on that front.
Yeah.
So maybe as a society, we're headed in the right direction.
There's a little hope there. Yeah.
And being the one who brings this back from systemic change to change in the individual, you have this quote towards the end of the book that I just loved and I think is a really nice reframe of the struggle of having to deal with burnout. And the quote goes like this: I don't wish burnout on anyone, but if there is a silver lining of a burnout experience, it's that sometimes it can spark growth and inspire positive change. Burnout might be an indication that we have lost our way, that we need to do some soul searching to learn about ourselves or find a new direction. It can be a catalyst for change.
Yeah, the third section of the book is all about change, right? Because we have the internal transformation piece, but we also sometimes do need to change something. So Jill talked about, do you leave a job? I think sometimes we need to work on setting boundaries or saying no to certain things so that we get some of our time back and we get some stressors off of our plate. Sometimes we need to work on maybe some of our habits just so that we can recharge ourselves better. So it could be smaller day-to-day things too. And sometimes I think we actually need to do probably the one most important thing if I was going to give you advice, which is to get support. Because I think so often we are such social creatures. And so often when people are burned out, they're just not getting enough support. And that's absolutely key. So maybe you need to spend more time getting support from coworkers or people outside of the workplace or just connecting in some way that's going to help enhance your life. And so, yeah, those changes I think sometimes are good for us, but it takes a period of burnout sometimes to come to that. Like for myself, I got a lot better at boundary setting after I went through burnout and actually COVID as well, because I just got to this point where I was like, I can't do this anymore. I have to say no. I have to take some things off my plate, which of course we've had many episodes about this on the podcast, right? Like subtracting and saying no and setting boundaries. And it kind of forced my hand a little bit on that. And I was better off. And I don't know if I could have sort of kept it going without burning out. I don't know that I would have ever really had to work so hard at making that shift. And I'm really glad I did. I think it made my life better, but it was hard. It was a hard thing to do.
Yeah. But the good news is there are strategies. And even if the organization or the system doesn't change, there are things that we can do to prevent or manage burnout.
Yes.
All is not lost.
And in the book, I even tell you how to do some of these things. Like, how do you say no? How do you set boundaries? I'm giving you, a little nugget of help if you need it.
Yeah.
Yes, I wish I had this book in my 20s. Trust me.
Right.
Like,
Yeah, there's so many great applicable strategies. People are going to get so much out of it. Good job.
You guys, you're so sweet. Thank you. My fans here, my cheerleaders.
So I don't know if you folks know this, but at the end of movie credits, you oftentimes see like production babies. And the first time I didn't know what that was, I was enlightened that these were babies that were born during the production. And now that Emily and I were the co-hosts with you on the show, I feel like this is what would be a title for this? Like, this is a book baby. And it's the first book baby that I and Emily as full co-hosts were part of as well, seeing that book baby hit the bookshelf. So this was a real special honor to read the book and then get to talk with the amazing author, who's not only the author of an amazing book, but also a co-host and a colleague. So thank you for having the time. I know you're a busy author now, so you're doing all the podcasts. So thank you so much for making time for us as well.
It feels a little bit like the moment you arrive when you come on your own podcast as a guest. It's like, I have arrived. The book is out, and it's a good feeling, and it's really fun to talk to you guys.
Happy book birthday.
Congratulations, Debbie.
Congratulations.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.
So I have one question. I don't know if this is going to end up as a blooper or just have Debbie yell at me. So Debbie, I noticed one thing in the book. You write about the existence of a video where you're going down a ski slope and you're yelling at your husband. And I'm just so curious if we can A, see that video and B, put it up on social.
I am going to try to dig it up. Actually, I know that my husband has it somewhere archived, but it's an old one, so I'll have to see if I can
Do we need to beep over the audio track? Beep, beep, beep. I should not beep, beep.